Hi all, good morning to everyone. Most of you would be already aware about the supply chain network, supply chain map, you can say, right, within our industries. But let's look at it again one more time. If you look at this entire flow on the right side, you see you have a customers associated with your organization. Now, from the customer perspective, for your organization, a customer can be a distributor, a customer can be a retailer, or probably to some organization, it can be a real end user. Right? So overall supply chain may be bigger. A distributor sells his products to retailer, retailer pass it to the end users, right? Or there may be additional channels in between. Now, in this example, we are considering distributor as the customer for any organization. That means when you look at your primary sales, the distribution center which keeps the inventory of your finished goods sells it to the distributors. So in this case, let's take an example. You have C1 to C8 customers tagged to your organizations. Now each individual customer, which is a distributor here, would be tagged to a location nearby to their vicinity. Right? Take an example here. We have a distribution center in eastern part of India. We call it as RDC1. That distribution center would re- ship the goods to the customers which are more closer to the eastern part of India. Right? So you will also see customers are tagged to specific preferred shipping warehouses. Similarly, C3 and C4 are nearby to RDC2 and so on. Right? Now, people who have experience in SAP ECC or SAP Export, where do you see this kind of tagging? If you look at customer master in ECC, if somebody has created a customer C1, and if you go to the sales area data, you will see a tab called as shipping. In that tab, you would also see a default plant associated with each individual customer. That's how this tagging is allocated. This means primarily if C1 needs a finished good, it will be replenished from RDC1. Now you may think, okay, how is it relevant to me as a MM consultant, PP consultant? I know it's not. But from supply chain network perspective, it is important. From SD person, he or she will be able to relate that whenever I create a sales order, whenever I enter order type, sold to customer, ship to customer related details, and try to enter material information with quantity details, and I click enter, system automatically populates the plant, shipping plant. How does system able to identify the shipping plant? Is because of the customer master where default plant is assigned to a specific customer. During urgency, you may see RDC1 can also supply the goods to C3 or C4, but that's not your preferred supply chain, right? So we are talking here about a preferred primary supply chain as such. Now, if RDC1 does not have an inventory, then we should know from where this finished good will be sourced. Now, in this example, all four regional distribution centers source the finished good from a common main warehouse. That means my organization has a main warehouse located somewhere in central, which has a sufficient storage capacity to store the goods and supply to regional distribution centers as and when required. My main warehouse, if it has a shortage, it will replenish the goods from manufacturing plant. That means I have an in-house manufacturing facility where I will produce the goods. The goods production can happen in multiple stages, meaning that take an example of chemical industry. I manufacture an intermediate product. That intermediate product is also processed and form another intermediate product. I also procure certain raw materials, combine those raw materials in that intermediate product and make a formulation. That formulation is packed into bottles, into sachets. That becomes a finished good, right? So it may have different stages within the production. Now, in order to manufacture the product, I would also require components. And in this case, maybe component 1 is sourced from vendor 1, component 2 is sourced from vendor 2. Or even there could be cases where you have multi-sourcing. The definition of multi-sourcing is for same component, we have multiple sources. Then from planning perspective, you need to know in what proportions I want to pass these demands to source 1 and source 2. Or is there any preferred source? Like source 1 is my always preferred source. But if there is a constraint at source 1, I may decide to order manually to source 2. That could be the also cases. So in supply chain planning, we also need to know the flow in which goods will be produced, shipped, and stored in the distribution centers. That is my downstream location within my network. Right? On the right side is the most downstream location. On the left side, it is the most upstream location. So in this discussion, I'm also trying to give us some terminologies which are normally used in discussions. So if I'm talking to a planner and if he's discussing about downstream, upstream locations, multi-sourcing, constraints, we should be able to relate to those terminologies and understand what he or she is talking about. I take a pause and see if there is a question on this discussion so far.
Vendor is the upstream, right? Here,
Yes, that's right, Sandeep.
it's okay.
So one question here, Sam.
Yeah.
So where does the price strategy come into picture here? For example, these RDCs are already split across different locations due to the various factors, including price. So here I'm talking about price.
Right.
So let's say if RDC, you gave an example that a particular stock is not available at RDC 1.
Right.
It has to be purchased from RDC 4, but these are already optimized
Correct.
as per the customer, right?
Right.
So how so there will be an impact in the price
There
if
will
I
be
switch
impact.
from one
Correct.
to other.
Correct.
So how it
So,
will be managed?
right. So right now the supply chain network, what we are discussing is more from the quantity calculation perspective and replenishment perspective. You're right. Based on this supply chain network, there are a lot of costs associated with it, right? With the in-house manufacturing cost, transportation cost, storage cost, and so on. And that derives the entire calculation from pricing perspective. And that's how your net selling price, including margin, is considered and being displayed or calculated. Now, the question is, if you decide to ship the goods from RDC 4 to customer 1, is it possible? For example, my RDC 4 is situated somewhere in South India, whereas the customer has an rush order which belongs to eastern part of India. Definitely, it will have an impact on costing, it will impact on pricing, but that time the supply chain takes a decision, what is the priority? If losing the sales order, I'm okay with it, or I adjust with my price, have some additional overhead in terms of transportation cost and supply the goods. But that's the final decision taken care by the supply chain director in cases there are such urgencies. Or what kind of relationship you have with your partners. Is it okay to delay the shipments instead of losing the shipment and ask the distributor to hold on for a few days, few weeks based on your lead times. Give a signal to manufacturing plant to produce it, or give a signal to warehouse to ship the additional goods and accordingly fulfill the demand. So there are different strategies again, but those strategies are, so Satish, those are based on the actual execution situations. Now here what we're talking about is more from the planning perspective. So from planning perspective, if I have a demand from C1, it has to be replenished from RDC1. If RDC1 does not have stock, I would pass the demand to main warehouse, seeking more inventory to be shipped.
Yeah, thanks, sir. And can you also please relate this to the monthly demand forecast, right? So,
Right.
how it will impact and what are the deviations? Because generally, one of the metric is to have consistent demand forecast, right?
That's
And
right.
any deviation is obviously measured. So, on under which circumstances will it have variation? And
Right.
how, I mean, these are common issues, right? So, how do we
These are
address
common
those
issues.
common issues
Correct.
using the tool?
Correct. So now if we talk about specific functions, yes, anyway, even if we are diverting, but let's cover this topic and then I'll come back to my original flow. So your question was valid, Satish. How do we then manage the demand forecasting? So how does demand forecasting, demand planning happens in this case, right? So take an example here. You within your organization, you have an account head, account management group, right? Who's responsible to make sure the inventory is channelized to right customers in right proportions. There are certain sales representative working under those account heads or country heads, as example. Those sales representatives are responsible to have consensus with your distributors, understand the forecasting from distributor side, indicating how much distributors are also predicting to sell it to retailers, or what's the season here, what are the ad hoc demands coming in, and that way they get a visibility of what is the tentative forecast this distributor or this customer is looking for. So that's the opinion coming from your sales channel, right? Sales representative is predicting that, okay, I know the situation more. There are certain events which are coming up in picture. Because of those, there might be rising the demands. There are specific promotions are also being planned. So marketing team has that visibility. That input is also coming back to supply chain. And with all this input, we provide this input to a demand planning function, indicating these are the real ground-based feedbacks. You can utilize those feedback and come up with your demand forecast. The other alternatives are, I do not worry about those realistic situation. I look at my history, my sales history, use statistical functions and predict forecast. Other options are, yes, I look at the feedback coming from sales, feedback coming from marketing, feedback coming from commercial, looking at the margins, new product introductions, etc., and so on. And also look at the sales patterns and predict the demand. Do the consensus discussion with all the stakeholders and then finalize my forecast to be sold from RDC1 to specific customer. This process is called as sales and operations planning, within which demand planning is one of the sub-function. So Satish, coming back to your point is, yes, one of the important function within supply chain is predict the demand, which will help you to at least identify the demand parameters as input, and then from the supply planning calculation perspective, start looking at your shortages, possible shortages, see how those possible shortages can be mitigated, pass those shortage signals to supplying locations, and generate your midterm production plan so that you won't end up having shortage, you won't end up having a situation of losing the orders, and at the same time you will not have more working capital because unnecessary production. So you want to give right signals to manufacturing plant to produce right amount of quantity with some buffer to be able to stock it or inventorize it in within the supply chain network. Some part could be stored in warehouses, some part could be stored in distribution centers, so that on top of your predicted forecast, if any rush order comes in, you should be able to fulfill that rush orders because of that buffer inventory. That's the KPI of the overall supply chain. KPI of your demand function is predict the forecast as close as possible, compare that with actual sales, and see the deviations in terms of higher biased or lower biased. Like, are you over forecasting? Are you under forecasting? Is one of my KPI. Now, let's say in this demand function, instead of the RDC1, because there was no inventory lagging, you ship the goods from RDC2 to customer C1. That means in your ECC system, you would have created a sales order on RDC2. You would have done the picking and shipment from RDC2. The sales will be captured as indicating RDC2 shipping the goods to C1. But this sales history you want to also consider from your demand forecasting perspective. So from tool perspective, there are options to manipulate this sales, because from planning perspective, if you start showing the sales happening from RDC2 to customer C1, probably it will give a wrong picture to planner. This was an ad hoc case during the execution decision. So from planning perspective, you want to manipulate a system and showcase the sales has actually been shipped from RDC1 only in any planning tool. It could be APO, it could be IBP, and so on. In execution, it has shipped from RDC2. So there are options to manipulate such information. Whenever you integrate your actual sales, you can have a logic in integration to populate the location based on the priority, based on the preference. Or you may still prefer to keep it in planning system as the same location from where it has been shipped. Then there are additional functions called as realignment, where you realign the data and say, I don't want to show this sales happened from RDC2. I want to show that sales happened from RDC1. Otherwise, my planners will start seeing that, oh, probably I started utilizing RDC2 as a new channel for shipping the goods to C1. And then they may, using that sales history, they may wrongly put a forecast on that combination, which is not anticipated. That's how the overall logic would work, Satish. Yes, such cases would be discussed in S&OP, adjusted, which we call it as corrections, right? So we will also talk about more how does these corrections happen from planning perspective, right? Which is probably different than the reality from execution perspective. Now, with this example, probably we should have a virtual picture in our mind that, okay, this is my manufacturing location. Here, probably I would have central warehouse. That central warehouse should be able to ship the goods to multiple distribution centers, depots, right? A smaller warehouse within the regions. And those regions should be able to supply the goods to customers. From left side to right side, it's a goods flow. Goods will be produced on the left side of the Excel, and then it will start moving towards the right side. Whereas from right side to left side, it is the demand flow. Demand would be generated at my downstream location, at my customer level, at my distribution center level. And from there, that demand in terms of shortages, net requirements, will start passing to my left side of the Excel. Right? So people who have bit of supply chain exposure should be able to visualize it. People who do not have, the intention is they should have this high level picture in their mind. This is how a normal supply chain would look like. There will be complexities in it. In reality, you will start seeing that, okay, even if you have a higher demands, your manufacturing locations are not able to produce those goods because there could be constraints within supply chain. Constraint can be non-availability of raw materials, non-availability of labor, non-availability of machines, right? And so on. So in that case, how does the supply and demand balancing would work? That's again the topic of sales and operations planning, right? That's where you would also have operational decisions to see if you want to increase your shifts, if you want to decide if you want to subcontract some of the quantities or products, right, in order to fulfill those demands, or you want to lose that demand, or you want to shift the demand from product 1 to product 2 in order to balance your revenue projection calculations. All these complex discussions are part of sales and operations planning process. And that's why we will see understanding the supply chain and taking right decision. In order to take those right decision, we need a proper tool which will give me a visibility of exceptions, which will give me a visibility of alerts, and will help me to take right amount of decisions in order to fulfill my service delivery. Right? That's my key KPI. Right? We are not talking about system. We are still on the process, trying to understand nitty-gritties of supply chain planning, and then we'll start seeing how these individual models will come in picture. I'll take a pause and see if there is any question.
So, Sam, sorry, NISTR, can you just shout as STR? What is
Yes,
STR here? Stock
yes, yeah. So
transfer.
I'll come back to that point. So we did
Uh,
not discuss this topic yet, right?
uh,
So right now we got a picture of high-level supply chain network. I see good amount of participants joined today. Not sure by at what time they had joined, but yes, they can go through the recordings just to catch up again.
Sham, sorry, this
Yes,
is
Murli.
Murli. I joined late. Could you please tell me what exact extra features compared to SNP to this IBP? What exactly
Yes, yes.
better
So
features are there compared to SNP? This one in this scenario itself.
right. I Your question is on the tool, Murli. The features of SNP from, and when you say SNP, I'm thinking you're talking more from APO perspective to IBP, right? So I
Yeah.
hold on that question. Let's go through the flow details one more time, and then if I miss it out, just remind me again. Okay, but we'll clarify that part.
Okay. Okay. Thank
Okay,
you.
right. Now, when I'm talking about this supply chain planning concept altogether, right now my intention is to bring you all onto a more thought process of sales and operations planning. Within planning, we have different modules altogether, right? One module, as Satish mentioned, is related to predicting the forecast, predicting the demand, right? So there is a function called as demand planning. Maybe I'll try to use some of the Excel cells here. Okay. So we said there's one function which is responsible to predict the demand. A process related to it is called as demand planning. Within demand planning, you have sub-processes. We'll discuss those in details once we get into the curriculum. Once you finalize your forecast, what is the next step? Next step is looking at this demand at individual locations look at your stock elements, look at your firm order elements, and see if you have a shortage. If there is a shortage, that shortage needs to be fulfilled from the location which ships the good to the distribution center, to the downstream location, right? If there is a shortage again in the supplying location, that supply location will again try to find out its preferred source. And that's how the signals will be passed to manufacturing plant. All this calculation of finding out the demand, look at the stocks, look at the firm orders, calculate shortage, which is nothing but your net requirement calculation. Identify the source, which is called as source determination. Pass that shortage quantity to the supplying location using the concept of economical order quantity, roundings, minimum lot size, right? So here the quantity optimization also happens. And then passing the demand till manufacturing plant in the midterm horizon is called as supply planning. Some people also call it as supply network planning based on modules and so on, but overall the process would be supply planning process, which is high level calculation of your net requirements, passing those net requirements to the supplying plant or supplying location till the upstream location of your network. If manufacturing plant has shortages, passing that shortages of components to suppliers, to vendors will also be part of this supply planning calculations. Right. In some organizations, you may see supply planning is divided into two parts, maybe based on the functionality. So you may see supply planning term is more used for finished goods, and similar function which is materials requirement planning is used for components. Yeah, but it's overall same concept, like identifying the shortages, passing it to your supplying locations, and try to give the visibility to supply location on the demand signals for midterm horizon. Once your manufacturing plant has signals, what you would like to do is manufacturing plant would have signals into the day buckets, into the week buckets, because you're talking about the midterm planning. Now your manufacturing execution team should focus only on the short term to see what do I need to produce in next 1 week, in next 2 weeks, in next 3 weeks max. If I have to produce something on Monday, do I have sufficient inventory of raw material? If not, shall I raise a request to my stores to get the stock of raw material into my production area, and so on? Do I need to make sure the machines are available? Is there any downtime planned? What is the best optimized production planning in order to make sure I have lesser setup times between one product setup to another product setup, right? That means your resource optimization. All these small, probably short-term planning is called as production planning. Now, since we also talked about optimization here, it can be also treated as production planning and detailed scheduling. People who have exposure to APO probably would have heard these terminologies, right? But people who have more experience into the execution, probably not, right? So since we may have a mixture of candidates here, I'm just trying to go slow and see if these concepts, if these terminologies are making any sense. So there is a function again within the organization who looks into the short-term production plans, try to optimize it, try to make sure that yes, the plan which has been generated as a result of demand planning and supply planning inputs is workable, should be able to produce also. In order to make it work, I need to make sure all those inputs in terms of raw material availability, resource availability, right, is taken care. And now I'm firming this plan. As a production manager or production head, I sign off that yes, these are the products which we will produce in next 1 week, next 2 weeks, in this specific fashion, with this specific sequence. And while doing that, I have also considered the optimization of my resources. There are tools to carry out such kind of detailed scheduling. The short form of production planning and detailed scheduling is PPDS. So you will see there is an existing module in APO called as APO PPDS, and which is now moving to S4. In S4, you have this EPPDS concept, EPPDS module. That means short-term planning, if you are trying to implement, you have an option available in S4, not in IBP. Now, we are done with demand, we are done with supply, we are done with production plan. For components, we are done with materials requirement planning. What else? So when we talked about this supply planning concept, we started from the downstream location, which is on the right side, and started calculating the net requirements. During my supply chain, I will have stock produced. It could be in production plant. I would have stock shipped to main warehouse. So the inventory could be in my main warehouse. So there would be a team required to decide how to ship these stocks or inventories to my multiple distribution centers, in what proportions, and so on what day, what is my lead time, and so on. That means there could be a case that my demands coming from multiple locations are more than my inventory available in my main warehouse. Could be a case where demand is higher than my supply, or I have sufficient amount of extra inventory, so my supply is higher, but I do not have sufficient storage space in my supplying location. So how do I distribute that additional stock to multiple destination locations, right? So there are two cases. Either demand is higher, how do I deal with that? Because I don't have sufficient inventory to fulfill all demands of 4 distribution centers, or I have now additional stock available, but I don't have storage capacity. So should I send this additional stock only to one warehouse or one distribution center, or use some proportional logic to distribute it? That function can be also called as distribution planning. It has, again, sub-functions within it, but right now let's focus on high-level process, which says, as a distribution planner, I should have clarity to decide how do I deploy the stock to my destination locations within my network. Now, if we start looking at these functions, SAP came up with an option earlier, during the earlier years, that we will give you a module which will help to manage all these processes within system and help your supply chain to optimize your working capital and optimize your inventory levels, and making sure you have higher service levels in terms of customer delivery. The tool which was proposed earlier was SAP APO. I think Murli, you asked the question, so I assume you have experience in SAP APO. Anybody who has a working knowledge of SAP APO, just type yes in the chat. Okay. So people who have APO experience will be able to relate to IBP. People who have experience in execution area will take some time to relate the planning functions. But yes, I have seen people transitioning from PP background and people from technical background into IBP. On top of it, people who do not have SAP experience are also able to relate it. The only thing is we should go slow, try to understand the concept, then try to understand how it is mapped in system, right? Should be able to talk in the same language as the planner speaks. And that's the intention of this curriculum, is not to just make us comfortable with system, but to make us comfortable with process as well, right? And you would find lot of roles within supply chain, not only from system perspective, but also from business roles perspective, available and being open. And being from the IT guy transitioning into a supply chain planner role should not be a difficult task for us. So over last 20 years, SAP say we are optimizing our APO functionalities. Over the period, most of the large scale organizations were using SAP APO. Then somewhere in probably 2010 onwards, organizations also started asking SAP that we are happy with your modules, you are evolving with the individual modules. That's good. But how about there is one horizontal process which touch base across all these functions, which is called as sales and operations planning. So it's more of a collaborative function which looks at demand calculation, which looks at supply calculation, identifies the constraints within demand and supply calculations, do the demand supply balance planning to see even if I have a higher demand, can I fulfill that? If no, what are the options available? And so on. And then come up with a consensus. While doing that, it does not only look at the individual smaller functions, but also looks at a wider functions which provides input in terms of sales forecast, in terms of marketing forecast, feedback coming from commercial team, looking at the financial projections and in terms of currency, right? In terms of US dollars. Those could be at a higher level of aggregation. And then decide what's the final aligned forecast at a SKU level, at a material finished good level within the organization. That function is a key function altogether because it requires a lot of consensus discussion, a lot of challenges to be addressed, which is called as sales and operations planning function. So you would also see there is a huge demand to play a role in sales and operations planning. It could be a global S&OP lead, it could be a regional S&OP lead, or it could be even a country lead to manage the country S&OP cycles. So when we talk about cycles, there would be specific cadence defined in a monthly S&OP to decide on what day, what decision is going to be taken care, right? So there will be a cycle associated with S&OP. We will talk about S&OP cycles when we'll get into the details of curriculum of S&OP. Then, as I was mentioning, SAP started thinking about this overall process. Initially, people who have exposure to SAP ECC, there is a part of sales and operations planning in ECC, but it was not evolved. It was not matured. And then over the period, SAP stopped prioritizing that module because they wanted to enable something separately. One of the questions which was raised to organizations was, how do you do it in nowadays real situation? So they said, we use Excel mechanism. Get all these inputs from tool and then use Excel to come up with this consensus to help understand the alerts and to communicate for the constant demand calculations. So SAP thought, if planning community is more comfortable with Excel as a front end, why not keep the same front end of Excel and build a tool in the back end to help them functioning this particular process? And that's how the thought process of IBP was evolved. And right now, if you see, the front end is still Excel, whereas in the back end, the IBP HANA engine is working on. Initially, they thought the name should be S&OP. So they started with a naming proposal of S&OP. And then somewhere around 2015, they evolved with this name called as integrated business planning, right? In a way, it's an integrated business planning, which requires a collaboration with different stakeholders within an organization to have a consensus plan. This is how somewhere around 2015, the journey of IBP started. And there were a lot of evolvements, a lot of enhancements done by SAP over the period to optimize or to mature the individual modules. So demand planning, yes, it is available in IBP now. Supply planning, yes, it is available, right? However, SAP is still putting efforts to optimize it, to mature it. PPDS, SAP said, we will not keep it in IBP. It is there in SAP APO. If clients want to leverage the similar functionality, we have developed that into S4 HANA. So you will see within S4, you will also have a separate module for EPPDS. What they call it as advanced PPDS. Distribution planning is also a subset of supply planning. SAP started bringing this module into IBP. It is there, but for order-based planning purpose only. We will talk about what is time series planning and order-based planning in details during these sessions, subsequent sessions. High level, this is how it looks like from the functions perspective. Now, if you look at it from the future prospects, if you gain an expertise in a system, but at the same time, if you gain an expertise in this process, and if you are able to talk to the planning community in the same terminologies, even in business functions, you would anticipate much more open roles. So do not keep your mindset only thinking about system or IT perspective, but also start looking at the start looking at how you can make your process understanding better and can grab any process related roles in future. And both are equally valued in supply chain organization, whether you are from the IT part of supply chain organization or from the business part of it. There are additional roles which act as a bridge between those two, right? Sometimes some people call it as BUIT roles, right? Which is a mixture of business and IT. During project implementations, there can be additional roles like solution lead, project managers who have experience in supply chain. There could be roles related to configurations, where we call it as IBP consultants. There could be roles related to testing. There could be roles related to deployment or even change management. If we have an overall experience in supply chain, you can pitch in yourself for any of these roles based on the number of years of experience. Right? People who have lesser experience probably more fit into a configuration build activity, but they would have more focus on system to make sure, yes, they are able to look at the IBP functionalities and try to configure them as close as possible to the business requirements. People who have more experience into other domains should be able to relate the business requirement, should be able to discuss the possible solutions, probably will fit into the solution lead roles or module lead roles. Right? People who are more closer to the testing area, right? They can fit into the testing roles and so on. So this way, I'm also trying to give you a visualized picture how this curriculum can probably help us understand the supply chain planning, understand the tool concepts, see how I can model my requirements into a solution, which is possible, which is not possible, how I make sure my system is kept as simple as possible so that a planner can understand it and do not make it more complex and make it person dependent. It should be a process derived solution. That's how journey of IBP started. I quickly go through the screen one more time just to showcase you the modules within IBP. We went through that last time, but not sure if all of us were able to join that session. So I'll quickly go through that slide also. If you see the screen, these are the submodules within IBP. Yeah, if you look at a high-level IBP platform, we talked about demand forecasting function. So we have a IBP for demand module. We talked about supply planning. So there is a response and supply function. Now, from supply planning perspective, when we were discussing supply planning, we also touch based a terminology called as buffer inventory, which is nothing but a safety stock. So SAP has an individual model to calculate your safety stocks, which is called as inventory optimization. So there are advanced technique available to generate your safety stock calculations, and you would see that in the inventory optimization model, which is also a subset of demand driven replenishment. People call it as DDMRP. Since these are all individual processes, individual modules, there is a horizontal module which cut across everything, which is called as sales and operations planning, which is more of your tactical midterm plan process, which also touch base the rough cut capacity planning from supply. And in order to take right decisions, you need some kind of mechanism where you see alerts, where you see dashboards, charts, analytical charts, etc. To handle those exceptions, there is a module called as control tower. Right. In this training, overall, it is important to understand the process and see how I can map that process into a solution. So when we talk about details, we will go through the details in terms of sales and operations planning. That means it will cover all submodules. But at the same time, when we'll do a deep dive, we will more focus on demand planning, which is the most evolved and matured module in IBP. We will also focus on supply part of it. Within supply part of it, as I mentioned earlier, there are two concepts, time series concept and order series concept. APO is more related to order based. We will see what does that differentiation look into. But what we will cover is, first of all, as a consultant, I should know how do I manage the supply planning and what are the nitty-gritties within the supply planning in terms of quantity calculations, shortage calculations, source determination, which are the master data elements associated with IBP, which derives all these calculations. What is the importance of individual field in this calculation logic, in this algorithm logic? So we will use the example of time series supply planning heuristics concept to give you a better understanding of how supply chain planning can be mapped. Right? Once we are done with that, I may quickly give you an overview of optimizer, but that's the next step. So people who do not have experience in supply chain planning should focus more on maturing their understanding in supply chain planning process with an unconstrained view managed by heuristics. Optimizer is an advanced planning where it also looks at the constraints within the supply chain and plan the constraint plan or generate the constraint plan. Right? We may have a separate training altogether on optimizer coming soon, but in this curriculum, we more focus on the basics of supply planning, understand the master data nitty-gritties, understand the field level importance, and time series heuristic concept so that we know end-to-end how this entire net requirement calculation happens. If I, as an end user, have a query on the supply plan, I should be able to troubleshoot the solution and come up with a reason why system is proposing X amount of quantity instead of Y. So more focus on S&OP, demand and supply. These are the key areas where you would see a lot of organizations are getting into IBP implementations. While doing that, we'll also touch base on the part of control tower, which is called as custom alerts. So custom alerts are internal parts of S&OP. So anyway, it can be, we can cover that in S&OP. Plus, SAP said, we will give you an easy mechanism to calculate, to know where your shortages are or to know where your bottlenecks are with the help of custom alerts. Once IBP is implemented, you do not need IBP consultant to come up with change requests, small enhancements, etc. Your super users should be able to also model these custom alerts and they should be able to generate the alerts and help your stakeholders to take right decisions. So we'll see what control tower custom alerts sub-module looks like. One important part of all this is scenario planning. That means as a planner, although I'm working on a live situations, I want to visualize if there is a change happened within my supply chain network in terms of quantity, in terms of constraints and so on, what would be the impact of that change across my supply chain, on my demands, on my supply? That is called as scenario planning. So you think about scenarios. Instead of disturbing your live data, how quickly I should be able to replicate it, discuss this in a broader forum, and should be able to take decisions to see what is the impact of those specific scenarios to specific situations and how do we handle those. In reality, it is called as scenario planning. It is also called as what if analysis. So we will also see how that scenario planning or what if analysis can be modeled within IBP. And it is also one of the marketing feature of IBP because it is quite fast. It does not have performance issues as compared to SAP or APO world and should be able to help the supply chain community to take right decisions in S&OP cycle. That's how I'm trying to give you a visibility of what we are going to cover in depth in the modules. Now you may also have questioned that in ECC, when I started learning about ECC, my most focus was on configuration, SPRO activity. Do I have such kind of SPRO activity in IBP? Answer is no. There is no SPRO as such, but yes, there is a configuration activity that needs to be done, which is a prerequisite. So if we are IBP consultant, we should know how I'm going to model my supply chain process in my IBP systematic way. That model configuration is important. In ECC, we used to call it as SPRO. In IBP, we call it as model configuration. So we will focus more on system model configuration. How do I model how do I configure my IBP system? That is a prerequisite to get into the solution mode. If I have wrong understanding of those individual model configuration options, the individual SPRO options, then I will configure the solution in the wrong way. So when we talk about model configurations, lot of new terminologies will come in picture. Terminology like planning area, planning levels, key figures, attributes. All these probably looks newer to you if you do not have experience in APO or BW, but we will emphasize uh, more attention onto the model configuration so that we create a structure of IBP configuration first and then start looking at how do I use demand planning functionalities, how do I use supply planning functionality and so on, right? So we will structurize our curriculum in process, then model configuration, and then get into smaller subtopics of demand plan execution, demand plan review, what if analysis, how do I create charts, how do I create dashboards from reporting perspective, what is the end-to-end S&OP cycle, right? How do I generate supply plan based on demand and so on. With this, it should give you a fair idea how any planning tool can be configured, irrespective of whether it's SAP IBP, whether it's Kinaxis, whether it's O9, the concept would be still same. The terminologies may differ here and there, or front end may differ, right? But person having experience in APO can quickly transform into IBP. Person having experience from IBP can quickly transform into O9 or Kinaxis based on where the demand is. What we need to learn additionally is the front end. Now coming back to your question, Murli, you said how SNP, what's the difference between the earlier SNP versus newer IBP? In APO SNP, you used to generate your replenishment planning proposals in terms of purchase equations, stock transfer equations, or planned orders. Meaning, every element had a identity to it, which either by looking at the sale, you were able to identify whether it's PR, STR, or planned order. That is called as order-based planning. You have an individual element tagged to that specific category. In IBP, SAP said, from S&OP perspective, you don't need that much of granularity. It's a time-based calculation of quantity. So it is called as time series planning. Whereas if you still want to use APO similar to APO specific module, we will give you an order-based planning module in response and supply. So that is also available. What's the difference? Maybe at this moment, APO's SNP for all functionalities are not that matured in IBP. You have functionalities being involved, but APO's supply network planning probably is a bit matured. And I have seen in last couple of years, SAP did a excellent progress in this direction. And now you see most of the organizations, since APO is getting decommissioned, are either moving to IBP response and supply module or to other modules like Kinaxis or O9. But SAP IBP response and supply is catching up now. And the key advantage what it has is its simplistic integration with ECC or S4. But we'll go through those sub-processes, sub-modules in details when we get into time series supply planning. Any question, team, so far on the topics what we discussed?
Yes, sir. Sam, Vijay here. A small question on the process, like, will IBP be doing midterm and long-term planning, or will it be like similar to our MRP run? How do we do in our PP process?
Yeah, good question, Vijay. So even if you look at PP process, MRP is also midterm planning, right? You calculate your materials requirement planning in the horizon of, let's say, 2 to 3 weeks. When you say long-term planning, high level, it's a tactical planning, right? Which covers the midterm horizon. Some organizations would say, I am okay to generate my plan for next 3 years or next 18 months. That's sufficient. So definition of midterm or long term can vary organization to organization, but mostly it is in the range of either 0 to 18 months or 0 to 36 months, right?
Okay.
Now, if you look at the supply chain processes, you can divide this into three buckets. Operational planning, which is very short term. Next week, what do I need to produce? Next 2 weeks, what do I need to produce? Or next 3 weeks, what do I need to produce? That's very short term focus, which is called as operational planning. Then you have
Okay.
tactical planning process, which says I need to get a visibility of my demand for next 18 months, see what are my shortages, possible shortages, and accordingly, I get a visibility of my manufacturing plan, also get a visibility of my components requirements, and pass this visibility to my suppliers, saying that, guys, based on my forecast, I expect you guys to make sure this much amount of inventory of raw materials is available at your side, and in these weeks or in these months I would be anticipating that purchase from you, so that better you plan accordingly.
Okay.
And then the third process could be strategic planning, which is more at a very aggregated level, not at a finished good level, but it could be at an aggregation of product family or brand or category level, and in a yearly buckets. Meaning that if I look at my FMCG industry, I would say my strategic plan for my personal care products in an yearly bucket is this much in quantity, versus your financial team would be also calculating their strategic plan for the same categories of products or brand within an year, but in terms of US dollar projection. That is your strategic plan. How do you want to achieve your strategic plan in next 5 years? What is the product portfolio with higher margins would be prioritized in terms of revenue projections, right? In terms of your margin calculations, right? And that will also give one of the input to your tactical planning process, that if I want to achieve my strategic plan this way, what would be the impact on SKU level forecast in my tactical planning horizon of 18 months, and then how do I deal with it? In strategic planning, you also try to understand your possible opportunities to increase your production capacities, increase your production plants, right? Or make versus buy decisions, right? Eventually, the strategic planning calculations will derive all those decisions.
Okay.
Yeah.
So is it like all the three scenarios you mentioned, the order level, strategic, and tactical, so that can be planned in IBP?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
That's
And will there not be any
operational
need of,
planning,
yeah,
Vijay.
yeah,
If you look at very detailed level, SAP said, don't use IBP. It's either APO PPDS or S4HANA EPPDS.
MRP? I mean, will MRP can replace this operation, this
Mm.
operation planning?
In a way, you can say yes. The only thing is MRP is a basic algorithm, right?
Yes.
So if you want to go with the advanced calculation, then EPPDS is required. MRP does not
Okay.
have a functionality of detailed scheduling, right? You
Yes,
cannot
yes.
optimize your network or resource
Mm.
planning, right? It will only give you a basic calculation logic that if this is the demand, if these are the parameters stored in uh, master data, this
Yeah.
is how the net requirement calculation will look like, right? It's more like a SNP. But operational
Okay.
planning, short term, either you go with PPDS, APPPDS, or EPPDS.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks, sir.
So people who are more interested into a broader term, definitely we should focus on sales and operations planning, demand planning, supply planning. People who wants to get into nitty-gritties of short term, then they should look into S4 EPPDS model, right? So you can divide your exposure into two areas: IBP from strategic tactical planning process perspective, is EPPDS from the operational planning perspective, right? So I have seen equal amount of demand to both consultants, IBP consultant as well as EPPDS consultant also. Okay. So we don't want to give you a wrong impression that you should only focus on IBP. People who want to get into nitty-gritties of production plan and detailed scheduling, EPPDS can be also option for them. Or it could be a logical sequence of first learning IBP, understand S&OP, demand, supply, and then get into a separate module of production planning in a sequence. Right? EPPDS, since it's in S4, it would be similar to your ECC S4 concepts, right? However, with S4 now you see most of the things are handled by the Fury apps. Right? So there would be transactions associated with it, but Fury apps are also one of the options available. In IBP, there is no transaction code. In Web UI, you have Fury apps where you use that for your configuration activities or for some of the admin activities, roles and authorization setup activities. You can also create your tabular planning views in Web UI. Plus, if you want to use it more from the day-to-day life, then the Excel UI is the preferred one. So there are two mechanisms. Either you use IBP with Excel frontend or with web frontend. We will see both. And I was talking about roles and authorization part. So we will also see as an IBP consultant how I should be able to design the roles and authorizations. In our earlier world, it was SAP basis team or security team who used to manage these functions. In IBP world, that dependency is gone. We can design and we can build this roles and authorization model. Because we are closer to the functions, we know what are the roles demand planner functions, what are the roles supply planner functions, and so on. So based on those detailing, we can design those roles in IBP. It's not a complex model as such. It's straightforward, and we can make sure individual person or individual persona has specific access in IBP. How do I manage that? Part of the rules and authorization configuration. While going through the learning, while going through the curriculum, we will use the live examples of projects to understand what are the situations in organizations in terms of demand calculations, supply calculations, and so on. In reality, how the S&OP works. Most of us who have SAP experience in ECC part lack this kind of exposure because for us, execution was the priority earlier. Now we are going one step back and trying to understand the end-to-end supply chain connectivity and how this supply chain planning actually works in the back end, which is my more key area than the execution. And that's why you will realize people, resources working in the supply chain planning domain in terms of business or in terms of IT get more or bigger packages. And that's how our transformation should be also. If I'm an expert in SAP PP, QM, MM, SD, and I know if there is a saturation in that specific module, what is the key module I should now try to learn? I take a pause and see if any question.
So, Sam, what is the DDMRP? Is it a part of demand or supply or separate module, right?
It is linked to supply module as such. It is high level. If you look at the process, it is similar to safety stock calculation. In our olden version or maybe conventional planning, we used to say if you have predicted your demand and if there are variations in the demand, meaning ad hoc order comes, and if you have not planned for that variations, you will end up losing those orders. That generated a need of having a safety stock in your locations. Now, if you have more safety stock kept in your locations, it will unnecessarily eat up your working capital because you have to produce that in advance. You have to procure the components in advance and so on. So there is an impact on working capital. If you have lesser safety stock, then you are challenging your service levels. You may end up losing any orders. So how do I balance my safety stock calculation? That is also one of the key area in supply chain planning. Then SAP said we have advanced algorithm in IBP, which is called as inventory optimization. We will introduce that module. While doing that, there is another organization, another set of people who said, I think safety stock calculation is a tricky part, but it's a conventional mechanism. Now we come up with some buffer inventory calculation using methodology of decoupling locations, etc. More to-depth algorithms. They came up with this algorithm and they name it as a demand-driven MRP, demand-driven replenishment. SAP took over that. And that's why this model came as part of official SAP's algorithm inventory. This is developed by some other group of people and now have a collaboration with SAP. And that's why it's part of IBP module. It is also part of S4. Both are same. Organizations do not want to go ahead with IBP, but they still want to calculate their safety stocks or inventory buffer. They can implement DDMRP in S4. Parminder has good amount of expertise on this topic. So when he covers the PP excellence curriculum, he also takes care of DDMRP. In IBP curriculum, we are not taking it. I do not have that much of exposure in DDMRP. And I do not want to give a wrong direction to candidates, right? But yes, people who joins IBP curriculum, we also make sure they are part of those DDMRP discussions in PP excellence training curriculum. But
Yep.
I would say it's a separate module altogether. And even if you focus on DDMRP, that's also sufficient. I mean, person can get a good amount of job and can survive for years if he or she knows DDMRP only. But people who knows IBP, S&OP, demand planning, supply planning, you can fit into any roles within supply chain organization.
So DDMRP just talks about the safety stock, right? How to
Yes,
manage
it's
the.
an advanced
Okay.
terminology of safety stock. Correct.
Okay, and now today it is coming from S4, right?
It exists in both. It exists in IBP also. You can implement a DDMRP module within IBP. It also exists in S4. So that's why I was mentioning, if any organization do not want to implement IBP, then for safety stock calculation, why should I again purchase a license of IBP? Then
Yeah.
client SAP says, don't worry, we will give you that functionality in S4 itself.
Okay. So Sam, in our organization, we just went moved from IBP to Orion, right?
Right,
So safety stock is just a one part, right? We are pulling
right,
from S4 now.
correct, correct.
So to get that number as for safety stock number, so there is a separate calculation happening in S4, right?
Yes,
That's
that's
what
right.
I understand, right?
Correct,
Okay.
that's right. So that
Okay.
algorithm is nothing but a calculation.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in order to come up with those numbers, we have to give some inputs to the algorithm. Coming up with those inputs is a challenge, is a key, right? So if you have expertise in inventory planning process, you can think over about of the optimized calculation logic and provide the numbers to that algorithm so that algorithm can suggest the accurate safety stock quantity. That's a key for us, right? And that's why this module is a bit tricky. Module is a bit more technical because it talks about lot of internal advanced algorithm logics, statistics, etc. Right? So you would see less expert people in that area.
Okay. That's why I think ideally it should be a part of inventory, right? They kept it separately now.
Correct. They kept it separately. Correct. Yeah, because the licensing is done separately.
Okay.
Now, you made a valid point. You said in your example, you're transitioning from IBP to O9.
Yeah.
Now I have started seeing many more examples where organizations started moving from O9 to IBP now.
Yeah. Because
The primary reason earlier was IBP S&OP was mature, perfectly working. IBP demand planning is perfectly working, but supply planning there were issues. However, now in last 6 months, that's also getting more evolved. And what I see probably from the pricing strategy perspective, clients started thinking about let's move back to IBP. So both cases you will see in market. People moving out of IBP to O9 or O9 or Kinaxis to IBP. Kinaxis is comparatively better than, I mean, mature than any other tools so far. But yes, O9 is catching up. There is JD, which is also catching up. And then IBP supply planning is trying to give a competition to those newer tools.
yeah.
For
But
this IBP to be successful rollout in a company, I think master data is also very important because in my company we implemented IBP, but we had lot of touch points in a lot of integration where a lot of master data were coming, and we had a lot of issues in the master data. So we faced lot of issues in demand planning and all.
Keshav, you made a absolute 100% valid point. For any planning solution to work, once you design that planning solution, there is no complexity as such. The only catch is if your master data governance is not 100% right,
Right.
then any tool you use, it's going to give you a scrap results, right? Because
Correct.
the parameters are going wrong. And most of the time, organizations only focus on the master data parameters during implementation, but during
Mhm.
steady state, there is no governance approach. Nobody
Correct.
knows what field needs to be populated, what business rule it has to have. And if even if a single field is missing out, it will
Right.
impact the planning algorithm.
Right.
And
So
yeah,
yeah, you're right. We've faced a lot of issue in the master data because our master data was totally in mess, and because of that, somehow we could not go ahead with the IBP. We have to stop in between
exactly.
because we have to correct our
Exactly.
master data. Yes,
Yes. And that's the reason organizations also should focus having master data experts who are actually experts from function perspective.
correct.
Most of the time, what happens, master data person has no clue about this functionality
Hmm.
and he or she doesn't understand the significance of that field,
Right.
right? And then people start working on a lot of workflows in master data domain.
Hmm.
And if some of the workflow is not managed correctly, ends up with a big mess.
Yes, you're right.
So with that, I think we'll take a pause for today. I think we had a good interactive sessions. Not sure if you had any doubts in mind whether to enroll for this curriculum or not. I was trying my best to give you a best example how we are going to evolve in this journey. Not only from the IT perspective, but also from the process perspective, business angle perspective. What kind of different roles we anticipate in organizations from business, from IT, right? How as an individual SAP consultant, this module will help me out, right? I'm trying to give you all this picture. Think over my approach towards going into this training is not PPT based. It is 100% system based. Not only focusing on step one, step two, step three, mechanical way. What is the business scenario? Why this business scenario is applicable? And how do I model this business scenario? That's the key, right? So people who have not enrolled, think over, provide feedback to Bhupender and team, and then next Saturday onwards, I think we will close this batch and we'll start with the actual deep dive from the original curriculum.
So one small question, like this is going to replace ATP and like that, advanced to promise.
Good question, Srinivas. No, it will not replace ATTP. ATTP is more from the execution perspective, which is advanced uh, promising tool, right? So when a sales order comes into picture, it also has some ATP checks to know whether this order can be confirmed or not. As one of the examples, similar cases there in the production side also, right? That SAP came up with a advanced modulars as ATTPA in APO, which is now replaced in S4. So you have ATTP in S4 itself. Okay, which is more closer to the execution part. When you are creating an sales order, system goes through those advanced checks, looks at the scope of check, and then figure out what are the elements that needs to be considered before confirming the sales order. There is a concept of location substitution or location product substitution, etc. in the ATTP. IBP doesn't cover that. IBP is more into the supply chain planning space, not from the execution space.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Thank you.
Hello, Shyam. Srinivas here.
Yeah.
I have one business question only. Its covers are not, I don't know, but DDMRP. For some cases, user want to keep as a safety stock in as a customer consignment stock. In that case, DDMRP is we can use that on solve the issue.
It will. The thing is, how do you model your network? It depends on, right? So you will also need to bring your customer into IBP network. They will be act as one of the entity within IBP, and
Okay.
then you will also model the stocks available at customer sites, and then bring that calculation logic within the algorithm. I haven't seen organizations doing that. First of all, DDMRP itself is complex. Understanding the output of DDMRP is also complex. Looking at the input parameters which I should give so that DDMRP algorithm gives me the best result is also complex. On top of it, in addition to my organization network, if I start bringing customer network into also in picture, this will also bring more complexity. In my experience, I have not seen that, but I won't challenge. I mean, you can attempt it. You can bring customer network into the IBP, model the customer focusing stocks, and input parameters for calculating the safety stocks at customer side or consignment stocks.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. My proposal is whenever we discuss these scenarios, these solutions with organizations, first of all, we have to keep it very simple. The moment we start making it more complex, and you guys will realize it, we as an implementation team is quite experienced. We will implement any complex solution, deploy it, but then we will hand over it to a very minimal experienced candidate support team members. And in steady state, if support team is not able to manage it correctly, entire solution will go on toss and people will blame IBP for its failure. So we have to go a bit slow, implement basic, use global processes, keep only 5 to 10% of localized variations, make sure the organization has good amount of experts as their super users because they are going to handle the tool going forward, right? And then that's how you transition them. Once they get a good level of maturity, then start adding more complexity into the solutions.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Shyam.
Perfect. So thank you all. Let's see. I think we have few people already nominated and enrolled. So we will not wait anymore. Next Saturday onwards, we'll close this enrollment and start the batch. Right. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.